I am of certain convinced that the greatest heroes are those who do their duty in the daily grind of domestic affairs, whilst the world whirls as a maddening dreidel. These words were spoken by the Lady of the Lamp, a woman who sought not fame nor glory, but only to save lives. As wounded men groaned from their suffering all through the night, and the fetid odour of decay and infection choked the air, the nightingale walked the wards, providing care and reassurance with a heavy heart. The nurse became a Victorian icon for a form of courage that few had ever considered. Her name was Florence Nightingale. Heroism can take the unlikeliest of shapes, and anyone who can understand this can see the charm of High Rock. According to some imperial scholars, Bretons are not an imaginative people. Their villages are pleasant collections of half-timbered structures of 1 or 2 stories, with the rustic inn, a shop or two, and perhaps a lordly manor completing the picture. The traveller need not visit more than a handful of Breton communities before satisfying himself that he has captured the flavour of the whole. The people too, despite their cherished particularism, are remarkably similar in name, accent and dress throughout the province. We've criticised the lack of originality in the portrayal of High Rock and the Bretons before on the channel, especially when compared to some of the concept art available. But to dismiss an entire race of people due to their unassuming sense of style and the simplicity of their architecture would be foolish. The Bretons watched as the Durenni High Elves built their mighty empire. The Bretons were born from it, subjugated by it, and eventually they saw it collapse. The scholars may exalt the achievements of the Durenni and the radiance of their culture which emanated from the adamantine tower, but the Bretons managed something the elves could not. They endured. As the Durenni dwindled in power and population, the Bretons were operating beneath the eyes of history, unnoticed by the mighty, and their rise in High Rock was through commerce and the foundation of small villages in well-chosen positions, such as the sleepy fishing hamlet of Wayrest, on the coast between the Bjolsay River and the Iliac Bay. Daggerfall, Camlorn, Reich Gradkeep, and many other Nordic cities became Breton, not by any act of war, but simply by being assimilated by them. By the end of the First Era, High Rock was the land of the Bretons, and would be so ever after. If you believe empires should be built on the blood of your enemies, then you may venerate Tiber Septim, but the Bretons achieved a great deal by rolling up their sleeves and doing the jobs that needed to be done. The heroism of the common folk is at the very foundation of Breton-dominated High Rock. This is what leads us to the rugged individualism of the average Breton. The old adage goes, find a new hill, become a king, and even the lowliest serf can strive for greatness. Youths of all professions and trades in High Rock spend their free time in knightly pursuits, real and imagined, performing good deeds and the like for all and sundry, in oft vain efforts to achieve, one day, a noble status. This quest obsession more than anything has served as High Rock's sense of national identity, a peculiar form of altruism and mutual reliance that binds its people together. Breton culture may not be the most alien, or the most mythical, but it inspires heroism in its people, and it allows for the unlikeliest of journeys, in which the smallest, most insignificant person can write themselves into legend. A wise old halfling once said, "It's a dangerous business going out your door. You step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to." Hey guys, it's Drew here and welcome back to Fudge Muppet. It's been a little while since the last of these videos in which I try to determine the greatest member of each race, and as many of you have reminded me, it's an absolute travesty for me to leave out the Bretons, who idolise the virtues of chivalry and heroism more than any other race. Well, today's the day. I've got quite the list of high achievers. Some feature heavily in the histories, others only fleeting mentions. But first, let's deal with the ones I've decided to disqualify from the list. I'm sure some of you have your pick for greatest Breton already, and a good few of you probably picked this guy for good reason. But I'm sorry to say, he's been disqualified. This Breton is Hjalti Earlybeard, the infamous young warrior from the kingdom of Alcair on the coast of High Rock. Before there was the god Talos, there was the great emperor Tiber Septim, perhaps the greatest in Cyrodiil's history. But his origins, just like his apotheosis, are shrouded in mystery, Some say Talos Stormcrown came down from Atmora, became a legendary tongue, and proved himself to be the bane of Reachmen by age 20. However, there are alternative theories about his birth. Some of these conflicts arise due to the triangled nature of Talos the god, the merged mythos of three figures, Hjalti, Arctus, and Wolfhalf. Zurin Arctus, the Underking, former Imperial battle mage of Tiber Septim, revealed his heretical truth about Talos. According to Arctus, the young warrior who came to Culacain's aid at the Battle of Old Hroldan and achieved great renown was not Talos of Atmora, but rather Hjalti Earlybeard of Alcair. Like so many Bretons, Hjalti was enamoured with the notion of becoming a warrior of legend. The Western Reach was at war. Culacain, the king of Falkreath in West Cyrodiil, was in a bad situation. To make any bid at unifying the Clovian estates, he needed to secure his northern border, where the Nords and Reachmen had been fighting for centuries. He allied with Skyrim at the Battle of Old Hroldan. Rumours were abound in the north that a warlord would rise to rule Tamriel, and one Breton rose to the call. Leading Culacain's forces was Hjalti Earlybeard. Hjalti was from the island kingdom of Alcair in High Rock, and would become Tiber Septim, the first emperor of all Tamriel. Hjalti was a shrewd tactician, and his small band of Colovian troops and Nord berserkers broke the Reachman line, forcing them back beyond the gates of Old Hroldan. A siege seemed impossible, as Hjalti could expect no reinforcements from Falkreath. That night a storm came and visited Hjalti's camp. It spoke with him in his tent. At dawn, Hjalti went up to the gates, and the storm followed just above his head. Arrows could not penetrate the winds around him. He shouted down the walls of Old Hroldan, and his men poured in. After their victory, the Nords called Hjalti Talos, or Stormcrown. The Underking, despite espousing Hjalti's achievements, made a bold, even sacrilegious claim. The man who would be immortalized as Talos was not an individual. The Breton warlord was only a fragment of the god. Ismir Wolfhalf, Shaw's tongue and breath of Kine, was the storm that came to Hjalti's camp and gave him the power to shout down the walls of Old Hroldan. If Zurin Arctus speaks the truth, then Talos is part Breton, and the warlord who became Tiber Septim was born a Breton. But we'll never know the full truth, and it's nigh impossible to extricate Wolfhalf's influence on Hjalti's rise to power. Hjalti Earlybeard may be the greatest Breton ever to have lived, but just like the true identity of Talos, he will be left out of the histories, and will not be crowned greatest Breton by me. There are two other honourable mentions who, despite their achievements, will be disqualified. Many claim that the Witchmen of the Reach are Bretons, but I would argue that the connection between the two lies in proximity alone. The Reach folk are much closer to their Nedic origins than the Bretons are, and they were largely unaffected by the spread of the Dureni throughout High Rock. There's no doubt that some elven blood entered the Reach, but I would say they deserve their own list. Durkarak the Black Drake, the Reachman who seized the Cyrodiilic Empire and started the Longhouse dynasty, and Red Eagle, who raised his flaming sword in defiance of the might of Empress Hestra and the First Briarheart. These men could rival anyone on this list, but like all Reachman uprisings, I'm gonna suppress them for now. But now it's time to talk about the real Manmur of High Rock, those who were born into Breton culture, the society that flourished in the wake of the Dureni Empire's waning. The first and most mysterious of these figures only features once in the documented history of Tamriel. When the Bretons came into being, back at the height of Dureni control, the half-breeds were given privileged positions in society when compared to Nedic humans. But nevertheless, they were always considered sub-Mer. Somehow, despite these limits on Breton ambition, there was a Breton sage so gifted that the Dureni allowed him to visit the monks of Artaeum. According to the text on Artaeum, the earliest written record of Sigix is from the 20th year of the First Era, and tells the tale of a renowned Breton sage and author named Vernet, travelling to the Isle of Artaeum to meet with Iachesis, the Right Master of the Sigix. This was the first time the Sigic Order was ever mentioned in writing, and the mortal responsible for documenting his experience was Vernet. This is all we know of the sage, but it's safe to say that his talents must have been exceptional if he attained this much renown in a society that viewed Bretons as lesser mongrels. There are various other venerated figures in High Rock with scarce little information about their deeds. These men and women are referred to as saints or revered persons from region to region. There are saints like Elenika, a priestess of Arche who was so devout that her prayer book is considered a holy relic, capable of returning the undead to their rest. There's Saint Pelin the Martyr, who became a folk hero in Evermore for his valiance fighting the infamous Grey Host in Bankarai. Some revered persons include Gairen Vardengrot, the immortal Breton wizard, prophesied by the gods to be a champion of High Rock's interests and a guide to her people. There's also the Viridian Sentinel. This is a title as opposed to one Breton, but it is said that the settlers of northern Bankarai were constantly harassed by beasts of the wild and wily witches. Their farms were overrun, and the people were on the brink of starvation when a young boy prayed to Stendarr for aid. Stendarr taught the youth how to forge a pact with the forest, giving him the power to ward off the creatures that lurk within. Without a doubt, there are many more Bretons who feature in folktales across the province, but now let's talk about those we know more intimately. The next great Breton rose the ranks of the Lion Guard Knightly Order before making such a name for himself that even the gods were made aware. Darien Gautier of Camlorn had a noble birth, but grew up without a mother. Prior to Molag Bal's plane meld, Darien had visions of dark anchors falling from a blackened sky. Little did he know he was auguring the apocalypse to come. Gautier proved himself to be a valiant knight in Second Era 582. Initially he fought in his homeland of High Rock, defending Camlorn from the notorious werewolf menace. He fought a cult of necromancer Reachmen in the highlands of Glenumbra, assisted the Vestige in the liberation of North Point, and in the protection of Queen Arzela in Bankarai. And these feats were only the beginning. With a new existential threat descending from the sky, Darien enlisted with the Fighters Guild and took his fight into the folds of Oblivion. It is said that Gautier played a pivotal role in the battle with Molag Grunda's legions, and in the detonation of the Planar Vortex. It seemed as though the fallout of this destruction had consumed Darien, but in truth, he'd been trapped within the coloured rooms of the Glister Witch. Gautier would soon discover that he was no captive, and Meridia had in fact spared his life, so that he may become her champion. Across multiple Tamrielic pantheons, Molag Bal and Meridia have had a turbulent relationship. In Khajiiti teachings, it is said that Meridnunda was the wife of Molag, while in other cultures, the two were constantly feuding. The Meridia-worshipping Aileids of Deladil warred with the Baal-worshipping Aileids of Abergalas. And of course, there is the myth of Meridia creating Mehrunes Dagon in the very bowels of Lig to overthrow Molag Bal's dominion. So during the plane meld, it should come as no surprise that Meridia would play some part in the foiling of Bal's schemes. Darien Gautier re-emerged as Meridia's Golden Knight and wielded Dawnbreaker against Nocturnal at the climax of the Daedric War. Prior to the warp in the west, which narrowed High Rock down to a handful of kingdoms, there were dozens of independent sovereignties in the province. It's safe to say High Rock has produced its fair share of prosperous kings. One king, who ruled Daggerfall in the 10th century of the First Era, made quite the name for himself. Unlike many monarchs who send brave men to war at their behest, King Joil of Daggerfall was no stranger to battle and died a decorated hero. Much of his reign has been forgotten to time, but his controversial contribution to the resolution of the Siege of Orsinium has been immortalised in song and story. It was First Era 948 when King Joil finally tired of Orcish expansion in High Rock. Under the leadership of King Golkar, the Orsimer were tenacious in their efforts to seize a portion of the Builse River. With control of the river, the Orcs would be able to place tolls and tariffs on goods travelling to and from the prosperous city of Wayrest nearby. Joil wished to gain a total victory over the Orcs with minimal casualties. At this time, Wayrest was not a kingdom, and lacked the military might to aid in the assault of Orsinium. Thus, Joil looked elsewhere, and corresponded with the legendary warrior and leader of the Order of Diagna, Gaiden Shinji. With the aid of Diagna's order and the Kingdom of Sentinel in Hammerfell, they were now ready to raze Orsinium to the ground. However, to the king's dismay, the Orcs were resilient, and Orsinium was a steadfast settlement, well fortified against invaders. Joil used every strategy imaginable to successfully infiltrate and capture the city, even allying with barbaric Reachman clans. But 30 years passed without a breakthrough. Finally, seeking an end to the war, Joil proposed a duel between the greatest warriors of each side. Gaiden Shinji of Diagna's order versus Baloth Bloodtusk, the ferocious chief of the Savage Sons tribe. This is where King Joil proved just how ruthless he was willing to be. By pitting the greatest of the orcs against the most prolific warrior in Hammerfell, Joil had found himself in an unlosable situation, a situation he aimed to capitalise on. If he could ensure that both combatants perished, then Orsinium would fall, and High Rock's historic southern foe Hammerfell would be weakened. So Joil sent a message to the leader of the Reachmen that said the following: "By the time you read this, a contingent of picked soldiers shall arrive beyond the siege lines. Secret them about you as labourers. Use them to strike when the duel begins. You shall be my headsman, so strike swift. Treat those who learn too much as you would any enemy of Daggerfall." Both champions were shot down before the duel could begin, and many orcs and redguards were slaughtered. In the aftermath, Orsinium fell without any remaining staunch defenders. Before even stopping to conglomerate his new holdings, King Joil pressed on to invade a weakened Hammerfell. Daggerfall's armies made for the Bankerai Pass and quickly overwhelmed the Redguard garrison. However, King Joil was unprepared for the presence of 6 maidens of the Spirit Sword. These Ansai warriors cut through swaths of Breton soldiers, and though all 6 were slain, the last standing among them, Makella Lecky, formed a glorious Shihai and sundered King Joil with one fateful blow, removing the head from his shoulders. With their leader defeated, the Bretons of Daggerfall were routed. They lost heart and fled from the pass, and Daggerfall was left kingless. Of all High Rock's countless kings, one stands above the rest, and his name was Emmerich. They say absolute power corrupts absolutely. A man may be chosen to lead for his gallantry, his virtues, his benevolence, but once power is attained, avarice and conceit take hold. A king must exercise forbearance and magnanimity, with no one but the gods to hold them accountable. Emmerich of Cumberland once dreamed of winning his crown and the satisfaction of rule, but the consequences of power are wearisome, as he would soon discover. Emmerich was schooled in economics, in the tracking of shipments, the balancing of accounts, and the fluctuation of currencies. But he was also trained in martial matters, sparring with the Master at Arms, riding and leading knights against goblins, brigands and reachmen. His father, Earl Pierick of Cumberland, was moulding his son for rule. At age 20, Emmerich began forging his legacy. In Second Era 541, Durkarak the Black Drake, first of Cyrodiil's Longhouse emperors, set his sights on the conquest of High Rock. Durkarak's Reachman hordes spewed from their mountain holdfasts, burning and pillaging and making sacrifices to their profane gods. Evermore fell fast, and before long the savages were across the Builsay, their sights set on Wayrest. King Gardner of Wayrest, ever prudent, had fortified his borders well, and the masses were safe from the Witchman advance. Emmerich knew this safety would not last forever. There were many mouths to feed, but the Reachmen lacked ships to blockade Wayrest's harbour, and had no siege engines to break down the outer defences. Nevertheless, the Black Drake would not be satisfied until the city was in his hands. For 57 days the Bretons endured with barbarians assaulting the walls. Frustrated, the Black Drake left some men to hold the siege, while taking the bulk of his force further west. Durkarak's haste reaped immediate rewards, for Camlorn was unprepared and was subsequently sacked. Then the Black Drake bore down on Daggerfall, the westernmost point of the province. While much of High Rock was daunted by the seemingly unstoppable Black Drake, Emmerich saw the weakness in the Emperor's recklessness. Daggerfall held firm to the west, and Wayrest stood strong in the east. If King Gardner took Emmerich's advice and mobilised his horsemen without delay, then Durkarak's forces would be caught in a vice grip. Emmerich counselled the king to use merchant ships in order to move the warhorses down the Builsay out into the bay. In a matter of days, the reinforcements from Wayrest arrived, and Emmerich rode at the head of the cavalry. The Breton lances crashed into the Reachman rearguard like a great wave, and the invaders crumpled under the force. Every Breton of Daggerfall and Wayrest witnessed as Emmerich of Cumberland slew Durkarak and tore down his unholy banner. Shortly after, the first Daggerfall covenant was signed. Fate brought Emmerich to the throne of Wayrest when the Nahuatl flu ravaged High Rock in Second Era 563. King Gardner and all his heirs perished, but the people were hopeful that Emmerich of Cumberland would lead them through the turmoil. No sooner than he'd been crowned did King Emmerich face his first major political decision. He could marry King Rancer of Shornhelm's daughter, securing a crucial alliance in the north. Or, the more controversial option, Emeric could wed the Redguard princess Mariah of Sentinel. To claim that Emeric acted rationally would be a lie, for he fell in love with the foreign princess the moment he met her. But there was a clear political advantage in the form of an interprovincial trade alliance. King Rancer didn't take too kindly to being shunned by the newly crowned young Emeric. He considered it a slight against his political power, an act of impertinence, and was willing to go to war over it. For a year he mustered troops and emptied his coffers in order to bolster his ranks with hired mercenaries. Enraptured by his new bride and preoccupied with matters of rule, Emeric was completely oblivious to Rancer's advance until the men of Shornhelm were at his gates. The ever-bold King Emeric, wielding his famed broadsword the Orichalc Scalpel, led the Bretons of Cumberland against the Shornhelm vanguard. As if by divine providence, the charge was supported by a storm so fierce, they say Kyne herself was present at the battle. The swift brutality of Wayrest's defenders, combined with the chaos of the storm, forced a retreat from Rancer's first wave. But the war was not won yet. Rancer returned with the bulk of his force, as well as siege engines. Unfortunately for Rancer, nothing but a quick victory would do, for his vassals were beginning to question the necessity of the bloodshed. Was Rancer's wounded ego a sufficient catalyst for war with Wayrest? And Emeric was not idle during the siege either. He was flexing his diplomatic muscles, calling upon the representatives of the Daggerfall Covenant, as well as his newfound ally in Sentinel. He even offered to restore Orsinium to the Orcs if they came to his aid. The Orsimer needed little convincing. They were eager for a free opportunity to ransack a Breton kingdom as prosperous as Shornhelm. With so many reinforcements coming to relieve Wayrest, Rancer and his besieging army were utterly destroyed. In the aftermath, King Emeric pushed for a stronger Daggerfall Covenant. This is perhaps Emeric's greatest achievement. Uniting the Breton kingdoms is already a substantial feat, but orchestrating an alliance between the Bretons, the Redguards, and the Orcs, free races with centuries of shared conflict and hostility between them, is nothing short of remarkable. We know that Emeric ruled for at least 19 years after this, but the full duration of his reign isn't known. Either way, there's no denying that, in a land where every individual can strive for glory and fame, where every man can become a king, every woman a queen, Emeric of Cumberland is the greatest king High Rock has ever seen. And that concludes the list of the greatest Bretons Tamriel has ever known. Perhaps there are others lost to history. Perhaps the common heroes are forgotten while the nobility takes centre stage. But I'm sure those same heroes, who plough the fields and tend the livestock, who fish and craft and trade, see no need in such lists, and are more satisfied by the simple things in life. Thanks so much for watching, guys. My name's Drew, you've been watching Fudge Muppet, and I'll see you in the next one.